On March 23, 1933, the German parliament voted to hand absolute power to one man. They did it willingly, they did it legally, and most of them had no idea they were signing their own death warrant as a democratic institution. The vote was 444 to 94. When it was over, Adolf Hitler didn't need parliament anymore. He didn't need elections. He didn't need the constitution. He had just convinced a room full of politicians to make him a dictator, and he'd done it without firing a single shot. That's the part most people miss. Before we move further, if you like to watch stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Now, let's get back to the video. Hitler didn't seize Germany by force, he absorbed it. Slowly, methodically, and with a level of psychological precision that should unsettle anyone who thinks it couldn't happen again. The strategy he used wasn't built on tanks or bullets. It was built on fear, spectacle, and the most sophisticated propaganda operation the modern world had ever seen. Here's how it actually worked. Before the Nazis controlled Germany, they controlled a feeling. The country was broken. The Treaty of Versailles had gutted the economy, stripped away territory, and left millions of Germans humiliated. Unemployment was catastrophic. Hyperinflation had already eaten people's savings once, and then the Great Depression hit. By the early 1930s, over 6 million Germans were out of work. People weren't just poor, they were furious. They wanted someone to blame and someone to follow. Hitler gave them both. The Nazi Party in 1928 was a fringe movement. They won 2.6% of the vote, a joke. But Hitler understood something his rivals didn't. You don't win people with policy papers, you win them with emotion, with rage, with spectacle. He flew from city to city by plane, which was almost unheard of for a politician at the time. He held rallies that felt more like religious experiences than campaign events, with torchlit processions, synchronized chanting, and speeches that started almost in a whisper before building to a screaming crescendo. By 1930, the Nazis had surged to over 6 million votes. By July 1932, they were the largest party in Germany. And he hadn't changed a single policy. He'd only changed how people felt. But winning votes wasn't enough. Hitler needed something more. He needed a crisis. And if one didn't come naturally, he'd manufacture it. On the night of February 27, 1933, barely 4 weeks after Hitler was appointed chancellor, the German parliament building erupted in flames. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found at the scene. The Nazis declared it the opening act of a communist revolution. Hitler reportedly arrived at the burning building and screamed that there would be no mercy now. Within hours, communist leaders were being dragged from their homes. The very next morning, President Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree. It suspended freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, the right to privacy in your own mail and telephone calls, the right to trial before imprisonment. All of it gone overnight. And here's the darkest irony. Most Germans didn't protest. They were afraid. The decree had been framed as protection from the communists, from chaos, from the collapse of order. That framing would become the regime's signature move. Every act of tyranny was dressed up as an act of safety. With civil liberties suspended, the Nazis tore through their opponents. Thousands of communists and social democrats were arrested. Their newspapers were shut down. Their meetings were banned. Then came the election of March 5, 1933, held under conditions of open intimidation. Stormtroopers stood outside polling stations. Opposition parties couldn't campaign. The Nazis still only won 44%. It wasn't a landslide, but it was enough. 18 days later, the Enabling Act, the vote that killed German democracy. SA paramilitaries surrounded the Opera House where Parliament was meeting. Hitler gave the assembled lawmakers a choice. In his words, war or peace. The Catholic Center Party, having been promised their rights would be protected, voted yes. Only the Social Democrats voted no. Their leader, Otto Wels, gave what many historians consider the last free speech in the German Reichstag, knowing full well what it would cost. It didn't matter. The law passed. Hitler could now make laws without parliament, without the president, without the constitution. Germany's democracy had voted itself out of existence. But seizing legal power was only step one. What came next was something far more ambitious and far more terrifying. Hitler didn't just want to rule Germany, he wanted to rewire how Germans thought. He called the process Gleichschaltung. It translates roughly to coordination or synchronization. It meant bringing every corner of German life, every newspaper, every radio station, every school, every film, every painting, every club, every conversation, into alignment with Nazi ideology. And the man he chose to run this operation was Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was a failed novelist with a clubfoot, a doctorate in literature, and an almost religious devotion to Hitler. He'd once written in his diary about meeting Hitler for the first time, comparing it to a spiritual awakening. When Hitler appointed him Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, Goebbels understood his mission with terrifying clarity. He later wrote in his diary that propaganda need not be decent, gentle, or truthful. It only needed to lead to success. His first target was radio. In the 1930s, radio was the most powerful communication technology on Earth, and most Germans couldn't afford one. Goebbels fixed that. He commissioned the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, a cheap radio made of bakelite plastic and sold for 76 Reichsmarks, roughly 2 weeks' wages. A later model cost just 35. They were basic, deliberately so. The tuning dial only picked up local German stations. No BBC, no foreign news, just Goebbels. By 1939, over 7 million had been sold. By 1941, 65% of German households owned one. A 1936 propaganda poster captured the intent perfectly. All of Germany hears the Führer with the People's Radio. That wasn't an aspiration, it was a command. Restaurants and pubs were expected to turn on the radio when Hitler spoke. Loudspeakers were mounted in public squares so that even passers-by couldn't escape. If you were in Germany, you were listening, whether you wanted to or not. When the war began, listening to foreign stations became a crime. The punishment could be death. But the radio was only one front. Goebbels controlled everything. Every newspaper in Germany was placed under Nazi editorial control. Journalists were required to join the Reich Press Chamber. Editors who published unapproved stories lost their licenses. Anti-Nazi papers were simply shut down. The film industry was nationalized. Movies required government approval before production even began, and films deemed valuable to the regime received tax breaks, a quiet incentive for filmmakers to self-censor. The result was a flood of propaganda disguised as entertainment. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will turned a Nazi rally into high cinema. The Eternal Jew portrayed an entire people as subhuman parasites. And then there were the rallies themselves. The Nuremberg rallies were not political events, they were rituals. Designed with the precision of theater, they used light, sound, architecture, and sheer human scale to create an overwhelming emotional experience. Hundreds of thousands of people standing in perfect formation, torches blazing against the night sky, all facing one man on a podium. The message was wordless and absolute. You are part of something larger than yourself, and that something has a leader. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, would later reflect at the Nuremberg trials that through the radio and loudspeaker, 80 million people had been deprived of independent thought. It was, he said, possible to subject them to the will of one man. He said this not as a defense, he said it as a confession. But Goebbels' most ruthless project wasn't aimed at adults, it was aimed at children. The Nazis understood that if you control what a child learns, you control the adult they become. And they pursued this with a systematic intensity that remains one of the most chilling aspects of the regime. By 1936, 97% of German teachers belonged to the National Socialist Teachers League. Textbooks were rewritten. Math problems asked students to calculate the cost of caring for disabled people, nudging children toward the conclusion that such people were a burden. Biology classes taught racial theory as established science. History lessons reframed Germany's defeat in World War I as a betrayal by Jews and communists. Hitler's portrait hung in every classroom. Some first-grade readers contained stories about children meeting the Führer for the first time, describing it as the most thrilling moment of their young lives. And outside of school, the Hitler Youth waited. By the end of 1933, membership had exploded from 100,000 to over 2 million. By 1936, it was mandatory. Boys marched, trained with weapons, and learned to see the world through the lens of racial hierarchy. Girls in the League of German Girls were prepared for their designated role: motherhood in service of the Reich. Children's books like The Poisonous Mushroom taught kids to identify Jews using grotesque caricatures. A children's block set could be arranged to spell Hitler or form a swastika. This wasn't education, it was engineering. An entire generation was being built to specification, and for those who still didn't fall in line, there was always fear. The Gestapo, the secret police, operated with nearly unlimited power. They could arrest anyone at any time without a warrant or a trial. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to report their neighbors, their co-workers, even their own family members. The system didn't need to catch everyone, it just needed everyone to believe they might be caught. Suspicion became its own form of control. People stopped telling jokes about Hitler, stopped questioning orders, stopped talking to strangers. By 1934, criticizing the government was literally a criminal offense, and concentration camps like Dachau were already filling with political prisoners, trade unionists, and anyone who dared to dissent. Then came the Night of the Long Knives. On June 30th, 1934, Hitler ordered the murder of his own allies. Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, the paramilitary thugs who had helped Hitler rise to power, was shot. So were dozens of other SA leaders, political rivals, old enemies, and inconvenient witnesses. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was killed in his home. Gustav von Kahr, who had helped crush Hitler's failed coup attempt in 1923, was murdered, over a decade after the slight. The total body count was at least 100, some estimates go higher. The official story? Rome had been planning a coup. There was no evidence. But here's what should truly disturb you. It worked. The German public largely accepted the purge. Goebbels spun it as Hitler acting decisively to prevent chaos. The army applauded because the SA had been their rival. The Reichstag, what was left of it, retroactively legalized the murders. Germany's most prominent legal scholar, Carl Schmitt, published an article defending the killings under the title, "The Führer Upholds the Law." The message was clear. Hitler was not bound by law. He was the law. 5 weeks later, President Hindenburg died. Hitler immediately merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. The military swore a personal oath, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. Every soldier, every officer, a sacred binding oath to one man. And that was the final piece. The strategy was complete. Legal power had been seized through manufactured crisis. Public opinion had been captured through relentless propaganda. Independent thought had been strangled through media control. The next generation had been claimed through education. Fear had silenced dissent. And the last potential check on Hitler's power, the military, had sworn itself to him personally. 80 million people, one voice, one will. The genius of the strategy, and it is a dark, ugly genius, was that it never relied on any single mechanism. It was layered. Propaganda alone wouldn't have worked without fear. Fear alone wouldn't have worked without the illusion of legality. The illusion of legality wouldn't have held without propaganda to reinforce it. Each element supported the others, and together they created a system so total that even Germans who privately despised the regime found themselves going along, raising the arm, saying the words, looking away. Years later, when the ashes had settled and the trials were done, the world would ask how it happened. How an entire nation could follow one man into atrocity. The answer isn't comfortable, and it isn't distant. It happened one concession at a time, one emergency decree, one silenced newspaper, one oath, one cheap radio on the kitchen counter playing the same voice day after day, until the voice didn't sound like propaganda anymore. It just sounded like the truth. 80 million people controlled by one voice. Let that sink in.